Do you ever feel sick and tired of feeling overwhelmed and drained by the relationships around you? If the answer to this question is yes, chances are you probably have boundary issues that you are not consciously aware of. And in today's video, we're going to talk about these five crucial pieces of understanding about boundaries that will change the way you operate in relationships and empower you to have more connected, more fulfilled relationships, and also empower you to not feel drained and exhausted by connection with others. So, first and foremost, one of the first things you want to understand is what a boundary is. You can think of a boundary as essentially being this imaginary line that separates you from other people. And when I say separates you from other people, I mean it's sort of like your personal domain, specifically as it relates to your feelings, your needs, and how you manage your time. Now, I often think that people will see boundaries as creating a separation, but a boundary is not a separation, it is a joining. And what I mean by this is that when you are too busy people pleasing and pretending that something's okay with you when it's not, or pretending that you want to do something and saying yes to something you actually don't want to do, this is you showing up with a mask on. This is not you showing and sharing your authentic self with the people around you. And this can be especially harmful if you do this in the relationships with people you really love. And when we have a lack of boundaries for long periods of time, generally what I will see is that eventually we withdraw from people. We don't show up authentically. And as a result of this, we end up being resentful of them over time or exhausted by them, causing us to drift further and further apart. Now, if you're somebody who struggles with poor boundaries, this is not your fault because usually what happened is in your upbringing, these boundaries were conditioned away from you. In other words, maybe if you set boundaries with a parent, you were punished. Or maybe if you set boundaries with a family member, you were shamed or told that you were bad or criticized for having a boundary. And as a result, it became safer for you to adapt to that kind of environment by having no boundaries at all. But this is not a sustainable solution. Because while a boundary issue is not your fault, it is only you who can fix it, which means it is your responsibility. Now, boundaries are an essential expression of your true self. And becoming masterful at setting boundaries actually requires that you first understand the five major types of boundaries that exist, and then that you learn the art of being able to consider yourself when making decisions. In other words, I had a client one time who we'll call Julie for the sake of this video. And Julie said that she found herself constantly saying yes to things and regretting it later. And when we really dove down into Julie's experience, what we found is that in real time, she had this compulsive reaction to somebody asking her for something to just say yes. Because as a child, if she said no, she would get punished. So she feels unsafe saying no to people. And as a result, would compulsively say yes over and over again, even to things she didn't want to do or didn't feel comfortable with. And what was happening is in the midst of somebody asking something from her, she had lost the capacity to feel her own feelings in real time and notice if it was truly a yes or a no for her. In other words, she found herself not being able to really consider her own self when making decisions. And so what happens is we first have to understand what boundaries even are, where they exist, and how they matter to us. And the five major types of boundaries that you really want to understand are number one, your mental boundaries. Your mental boundaries have to do with your own thoughts, your own beliefs, your own opinions, and ideas. And we have two types of boundary violations here. We have people who can violate our boundaries, which we call other boundary violations. And we have when we violate our own boundaries, which we call self boundary violations. In other words, I may see myself literally share an opinion with a friend, and my friend could say, "That's a stupid opinion. That makes no sense. What are you thinking?" And that would be an other boundary violation, somebody violating my domain, right? They may say, "No, you can't think like that. You have to think this way." And that would be somebody else violating my boundary. But we can also have self boundary violations, which is what we often do the most to ourselves when we struggle with boundary issues. And this would look like you having an opinion or an idea that you feel is important and authentic for you to share with somebody, but you keep quiet and you pretend that you agree with somebody else. In doing that, you are violating your own truth. You are violating your own boundaries. You're repressing your own thoughts and beliefs or opinions or ideas because you're afraid of somebody else's reaction. And that is a self boundary violation. Okay. So we have self and other boundary violations in all these different five parts. Part number one is mental. Same thing happens emotionally. We have emotional boundary violations. Emotional boundary issues are when you don't know where you end and somebody else begins. You constantly take on other people's emotions, and as a result, they determine your actions. An example of this would be if in the workplace you feel sad for people all the time because you think that they're struggling with work. And so you take on all of their work and then you fall behind on yours. Okay. So because of feeling other people's emotions, you end up violating your own domain as a result. Okay. And this can be self or other. Somebody else can violate you emotionally by constantly coming into your space. I remember having a client and she said that she had a very busy job, but people would always come to her for advice, but she really needed space. So she would shut her office door and she would say, "Do not disturb, I'm working." And she put a sign up on her door and people would just come into the the office anyways and barge in and tell her all their stuff. And so there's a bit of an emotional boundary violation taking place there from other, right? From someone else. Number 3, we have time boundaries. Time boundaries play a massive role in our lives. A time boundary violation would be, as an example, if I have a neighbor who comes over and says, "Thais, I really need your help moving and I need it to be right now." And maybe I have a lot of things that I have to do for myself or my family that day, but I do it anyways because I feel guilty saying no. That would be a self boundary violation, right? In terms of time, I don't have all this time that they're asking of me, or I don't have the ability to do this right now when they're asking of me, but I do it anyways. I violate my own time to appease somebody else. We can also have that take place from the other point of view, somebody else doing this to us, right? So we have these different types of boundary violations in these major areas. And we have a couple more types of boundaries. And the more you understand these things, and then you take some time at the end of this video to consider and sit down and say, when it comes to these different types of boundaries, where do I violate my own boundaries? Or where do I need to set a boundary with somebody else violating me? And as you do this work, it will change the way you feel. It will stop you from getting burned out, release resentment, help you feel seen and understood by other people in your life. It's extremely powerful. But I do want to say before I tell you the two others, if you want to do a deeper dive into boundaries in and of themselves, you can actually check out a whole boundaries course I have with all of these exercises, how to reprogram your boundaries, how to understand what they are. You can check it out fully for free, just for 7 days, just for a limited time, using the link in the description down below. So after time boundaries, so mental, emotional time, then we have our physical boundaries. You can think of your physical as being your physical space, but also your physical domain, right? So it can be around sexual boundaries, somebody being too touchy feely with you if you don't like that, or you don't know somebody and it feels uncomfortable. It can also be somebody coming into your physical space when you try to set a boundary that they can't or they're not allowed. So we have physical boundaries that can exist with self boundary violations or others violating your physical space, even if you set a boundary there. And last but not least, we have our material boundaries. This can include your financial boundaries. So a material boundary violation could be something like somebody taking your belongings and not giving them back, or not even asking in the first place. Or a self boundary violation in the material area could be that you keep going out for dinner with your friends and you always pay the bill and you never let them pay the bill, right? So we can have these sorts of dynamics that are at play. And when we look at these different boundaries as a whole, mental, emotional, time, physical or sexual, and material, we can really start doing this. Okay, and this is the exercise I'm going to leave you with for today. Write down these 5 different types of boundaries on a worksheet and put them in different columns. So, mental, emotional, time, physical, and material. And underneath that, I want you to ask yourself, where do I violate my own boundaries to please people? I don't even tell people that I have a boundary. And I say yes when I mean no. And where do other people violate? And what is one thing I can do differently in each of these areas? And by doing exactly that, it will help you change the way you communicate, change the way that you show up with people, and really feel seen and heard. And also feel like you're expressing your authentic self in your meaningful relationships more often, which will only empower you to feel more deeply connected. So, really important exercise. Boundaries really have such a major impact on our lives, on our relationships. And I hope you enjoyed today's video. I put daily videos out here on YouTube. If you don't want to miss any, please consider subscribing, liking, sharing. And thank you so much for watching today.